Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I think that 5 key words can somehow summarize the challenges before us in Iraq. The first one is the challenge of sovereignty. This country needs to become sovereign again and as soon as possible. And the political process has been devised in mid-November 2003 in order to get there. The second key word is stability. That is the re-establishment of security all over the territory, dealing with the insurgency, offering security not only for those who are there, but also for every Iraqi citizen. The third challenge is the challenge of unity. After years of authoritarian rule, unity is a real challenge. And the question of the structure of the Iraqi state, the upcoming Iraqi state, and the question of federalism is at the heart of this challenge. The fourth key word is rights, the human rights, the women's rights, the collective and individual rights, the property rights, and therefore the re-establishment of an efficient, impartial judiciary in the country. The fifth key word is prosperity. This is a country, and for having spent 3 months there in the summer, I can testify to the fact that this is a country full of talent, full of trained people. And that is the most important part of the country's wealth. It is also an oil country and a country full of resources, material and otherwise. And this country can be prosperous and will certainly be when the reconstruction is really completed in that country. So the questions are before us, all of us. First, the Iraqis themselves. What could they do? But also before the CPA, the Coalition Provisional Authority, the coalition in Iraq. What could, and what would the coalition do? And of course, it's a question before all of us and before the international community and the United Nations, because no issue has divided the Security Council and the international community as much as the Iraqi issue in the past few months. And it's high time that we all agree that the stability, the security, the prosperity of this country is in everybody's interest, whatever his position had been before and during the war. To answer these questions, we have a panel of eminent personalities. First, Dr. Adnan Pachachi, who's a living example that energy has nothing to do with age, and that wisdom is consonant with a creative mind. We also have Mrs. Palacio, the Foreign Minister of Spain, who is to a large extent a permanent commuter to Baghdad. I have seen her twice there, and she went 2 other times since. She has been involved very directly in the drafting of the UN Security Council resolutions. She has been a driving force behind the Madrid Donors Conference last fall. We also have on this panel Mr. Jim Colby, who as chairman of the Appropriations Subcommittee on Foreign Operations in the US House, is absolutely ready and willing to tell us something about how dollars are going to be spent, how US dollars are going to be spent in that country. Mr. Hoshyar Zebari, after a long career in Iraqi politics, in the opposition, and in the leadership of the Kurdistan Democratic Party, has been appointed the foreign minister of Iraq last summer, and he's going to address the issue of the relations of tomorrow's Iraq with the neighbors and with the international community. Mr. Thomas Foley, after 20-year experience in business operating, is presently the Director of Private Sector Development in the Coalition Provisional Authority, and therefore would give us his views on the Iraqi economy as it is evolving right now. Kenneth Roth is the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch, and the issue of human rights in Iraq is today paramount. So let me start with Dr. Pachachi and ask for his views about the evolution of the political process in Iraq. After the November 15th agreement has been accepted, how he sees the political process in the immediate run, and what will happen between now and July the 1st, the day that this agreement has fixed for the establishment of a sovereign Iraqi provisional government, which means the end of the Coalition Provisional Authority and the end also of the Governing Council and their replacement by a provisional Iraqi national government at that date. Are we going in this direction? How fast? Are we going to respect the timetable as you have agreed to? Dr. Pachachi, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Shall I go there or? Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As you know, I have just come back from the United States, where we had extensive and useful talks in New York and in Washington about the future of Iraq, especially the political process which is going on now. In New York, we had trilateral discussions between us, the United Nations, and the CPA. The main thrust of those talks was our request addressed to the Secretary General of the United Nations to send a team to Iraq to consider the possibility or the feasibility of elections to be held in the next 3 months for the selection of the members of the Legislative Assembly of the Provisional Government of Iraq, which will take over sovereignty of the country, and when the CPA will transfer all its powers to it. We also discussed the problems of security, and we urged the Secretary General to send a representative to succeed the much lamented Sergio De Milo, and to reactivate the work of the United Nations in the political sphere in Iraq. We hope that the response would be positive from the Secretary General, and we expect a team to go to Iraq in the very near future. This is very important because we hope this will put an end to the differences of, I wouldn't call them differences of opinion, but rather differences of emphasis on whether the selection of the members of the Legislative Assembly should be done through elections or not. As we know, the Secretary General on 3 occasions said because of the shortness of time, it would be difficult to hold elections that are credible and fair. But anyway, many people in Iraq, a large segment of Iraqi opinion, believes that there should be a determined effort to see whether elections, in fact, are feasible. There are people who believe they are. Others believe that the time does not permit such fair elections. We hope this matter can be resolved when the team of the United Nations presents its report sometime in next month. Next month is important because by the end of February, we are supposed to have a fundamental law. We have a rather long title for that law in Arabic. It is the law for the administration of the Iraqi state during the transitional period. But it is the fundamental law for the provisional government and the transitional period. We have gone a long way to drafting this law, and we are waiting for further discussions to iron out some differences, but also, depending on what the United Nations recommendations are and what decisions will be taken as a result of these recommendations, which will be incorporated in that law, we hope by the end of February we'll have a law that will provide for the selection of the members of the Legislative Assembly, and also the way that the country will be run. I would like to say that we have a most impressive and extensive Bill of Rights in this law, which covers all aspects of human rights, of political and civil liberties. In fact, it's taken out of the various international conventions on human rights. We also have a rather simple, I think, way of selecting the executive by the Legislative Assembly, and we hope that the main task of this provisional government is to prepare for a constitution. In this process, I would call the constitutional process, the United Nations will play a major role because of its long experience and expertise in providing assistance in such things as the population census, as the drafting of electoral laws, the preparation of electoral registers, the laws governing the formation of political parties and other political activities, such as the rights of assembly and of expression. We also hope the United Nations can help us in establishing a judicial authority to ensure that the elections are fair and correct. Also, the United Nations will be able to help in organizing the elections for a constitutional conference that will draft the constitution beginning from March 31st of 2005. And the United Nations will also be involved if we are requested to do so in the drafting of the constitution itself. After that, the constitution would be presented to the people for discussion in town meetings, through the press and the media, because we feel that popular participation in the constitutional process is of the utmost importance. And then the draft constitution, its final form, will be submitted to the people in a referendum, after which elections will be held in accordance with the provisions of that constitution to elect a government that derives its legitimacy from the will of the Iraqi people. This is the plan. And we hope that we will proceed with it without delay, because the Iraqi people will not tolerate any delay in the transfer of sovereignty and authority to an Iraqi government. And therefore, we are doing everything we can to keep to the deadline or the timeline we have agreed on in the November 15th agreement, it should not be forgotten that it was because of the incessant demand of Iraqis that finally the United States and the coalition decided to change their position and accept the transfer of power without insisting first, as they did before, for a constitution. So the transfer of power will be made before a constitution is drafted. This was a great success for the Governing Council. We all worked very hard for it and were not prepared to give up that concession which we got from the CPA. But we hope, I mean, in the media, unfortunately, have magnified and they have exaggerated the differences of opinion regarding the method of choosing the members of the Legislative Assembly, the Provisional Legislative Assembly. I have a feeling that these problems will be settled very soon. And I think the United Nations will be able to play a very important role in helping us to do this. I'm very optimistic about the future of Iraq. Iraq will be a model of prosperity, of freedom, of human rights in the near future. Without this hope, we couldn't possibly work under the most difficult conditions you can imagine. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pachachi. Mrs. Palacio, you have been involved like hardly any other foreign minister I know of in the Iraqi situation in the past year or so. Do you share Dr. Pachachi's optimism? What makes you optimistic today and where you remain skeptical after such a deep involvement in Iraq, in the United Nations, in the Donors Conference, and elsewhere?
Well, thank you. I will try to keep the 3 minutes rule. Just to summarize, I'm optimistic because it's not that I believe, I have seen the strength of the Iraqi people, the daily strength of the Iraqi people in Diwaniyah, in Baghdad. That makes me optimistic. But let me just pick up your introduction and insist that a sovereign, stable, united, and at peace with the neighbors, prosperous, and abiding by the rule of law in full respect of human rights, Iraq, is the interest of all of us. It's the challenge of the international community. And this is what underlies the strong commitment of the Spanish government in backing the efforts of the Iraqi institutions, in backing the effort of the Iraqi reconstruction. Having said that, I would add that even in a globalized world, geography counts. Therefore, speaking as European, we cannot forget that we have to think not in the old Europe, which was in fact divided Europe and a small community. We have to think about the new Europe, which is the united Europe of 25 countries plus Bulgaria, plus Romania. And may I just salute the presence of the Prime Minister of Bulgaria, plus Romania, plus Turkey. Plus, of course, the challenge of the Balkans that we have to address. But these are countries that have to become members in the near future of the European Union. And the day Turkey is a member of the Union, Iraq is our neighbor. So, for us Europeans, every time we think of Iraq, even in this globalized world, we have to think of a neighbor, tomorrow's neighbor, our neighbor next door. My second comment is that in this framework, the three main issues on which the Spanish government we have tried to push forward as members of the European Union and as in our capacity as members of the Security Council for 2003 and 2004. First, the role of the United Nations. We can just argue it's crucial, it's essential. What is true is that United Nations have to be in Iraq, that they have to be involved, and that the reconstruction of Iraq needs the United Nations, and not United Nations by remote control, United Nations in Iraq. And I think this is one of the main short-term objectives that we all have. Our second line as a Spanish government within the European Union and in the Security Council is to have the full exercise of sovereignty as a process. We never shared this idea that at a fixed date, December 31st, 2003, as others advocated, sovereignty had to be transferred. We thought of the transfer of sovereignty always as a process, but that had to be undertaken with a full commitment to achieve it as soon as possible. And in this approach, there is a very European approach. We Europeans, we know very well that sovereignty is not a block that you have here and you have to transfer here. Sovereignty is a mass of competencies that you have to transfer and that you have to have the possibility of exercising full-fledged and with efficacy. The third idea that has been behind our cooperation within the Security Council and the European Union is that in order to have a reconstruction in Iraq, we had to have a constructive relationship. Iraq had to have a constructive relationship with the neighbors. And that's why the Spanish government has been fully committed with Syria and with Iran, with Jordania, full dialogue. Now, there is another issue, is that for us, daily life of Iraqis is very important. And that's why we were so committed to the Donors Conference. In order to improve daily life, we need infrastructures, we need these reconstruction projects underway. But you asked me for optimism. May I just say that in overflying Iraq, I saw greenhouses for a lot of greenhouses, which means that there are markets for lettuces grown in greenhouses and that there is a system of distribution. And may I just add another issue, which is also related to the Iraqi people and society. In my last two press conferences, last time I was there a week ago, there were many more Iraqi journalists than international journalists. And that in the streets in Baghdad, you could see plenty of newspapers. So there is a lot of energy in this society picking up. Now, one last remark, and I stop. You mentioned that the Iraqi issue has created a big divide. Once more, the European experience is very clear on building on divides. I think that there is not a bigger divide than a war, and Europe was built on the aftermath of a bloody war. And we know that it is by looking into the future, by creating concrete projects and by uniting behind these concrete projects that you create solidarity, that you create grounds for understanding, and in the end you create future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Palacio. Congressman Colby, as chairman of the Appropriations Subcommittee for Foreign Operations, you have been generous. This situation has been expensive. War was expensive, and the after-war was not less expensive. What is behind this commitment of yours? And to what extent are you ready to keep supporting financially an effort that looks like a bit more difficult than expected when it was started?
Well, thank you very much for that kind of question to introduce what I wanted to talk about. First of all, let me say I'm a poor substitute. I acknowledge I'm a poor substitute for Ambassador Bremer, who had hoped to be with us here today, but you have to take what you get, I guess. He spends the money, I kind of hand it out, or Congress and my subcommittee kind of hand it out over to him. And I do want to talk a little bit about the amount of money that we are spending and the ways in which we see that money going. So I guess if I look at your 5 points you made, what we're talking about really falls under all of those. And I acknowledge, of course, that the United States is not the only one that's involved here. There are many European countries, Japan, other countries that have been very significantly involved, Gulf states and others, in this reconstruction effort. So I'm talking largely about our own effort here today. First of all, the original supplemental appropriation for Iraq reconstruction was $2.4 billion, and that was in April of this last year while the fighting was still going on that Congress passed that, and it was a ballpark guess as to what would be needed in the immediate future. That money, along with the oil money and everything else, the seized money, has lasted us up till about now, but we're out. And we're now about to begin spending the next bit of money, which came in another supplemental appropriation that was submitted to Congress and which we passed in last October. And that's out of that $87 billion for the war, about $18.6 billion of that is again in the area of reconstruction. I would say that what we are doing in the area of reconstruction, I kind of categorize it in 3 areas. One, the hard infrastructure. Second, the human resources or human infrastructure. And third, what I would call soft infrastructure, soft reconstruction. The bulk of it is going into the hard infrastructure. That is, electricity is the biggest single consumer of the dollars, but wastewater treatment, freshwater treatment, the rebuilding bridges and roads, the telecommunications, and of course repairing the oil fields and the refineries is a very major part of it. That consumes a very large part of this $18.6 billion, which I might add, I think this is kind of important, is larger than the foreign operations bill we have for all foreign assistance for the rest of the world for the year 2004. So we're spending more on Iraq reconstruction than we are on everything else in the rest of the world that we do, whether it's AIDS in Africa or drug interdiction in Colombia or wherever that might be. The second area is what I call that human infrastructure, and the first main one there, and coming a close second in terms of actual after electricity, is security. A great deal of money is being spent, obviously, to stand up the national police and the army, and we put a very high priority on that. As the Iraqis put a high priority on their national security, on their security, we put a high priority on doing that, and we also believe that it's important for us in order to minimize our role. Healthcare and education would be 2 other areas there where we're spending money. And then lastly, with what I said was the softer things of democracy building, nation building, democracy building, the human rights issues, civic involvement, all of those things. Now, the questions that I have as a chairman of an appropriations subcommittee and that I want answered when I go over there, and I've been there so far twice, is are we spending the dollars in the right areas? And that's a question that I don't think yet we really have an answer to. A lot of it has been done with some involvement of Iraq, but I know that there's some questions as to whether we've had the right kind of involvement of the Iraqi people in making these decisions. But are we putting the dollars in the right areas? How are the contracts being let? We were very adamant that after that first go-round that had to be done with non-competitive contracts, that this next go-round, the one we're in now, starting now, has to be done with transparent and open and competitive bids. And lastly, are we making sure that we're using Iraqi skills wherever possible? We building Iraqi skills by using them to do as much of the work as possible where we're talking about rebuilding the infrastructure and so forth. These are some of the questions that we're going to be doing through our oversight process, and I expect my subcommittee will be doing a good deal more of that. We do not expect, let me just end with this thought, we do not expect to see any other funds appropriated in this coming fiscal year. The President's budget, which will be submitted in a couple of weeks, will not have any additional money for Iraq reconstruction beyond what I've just mentioned in that supplemental. That's not to say, however, that there won't be another supplemental appropriation, but I think it is probably safe to say that that won't come until after the November election. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Colby. Mr. Zebari, you are the Foreign Minister of Iraq. You have recaptured your seat in the Arab League, in the United Nations, in different international organizations. You have 6 neighbors you have to deal with. And what is the view now of your relations with your neighbors and of your relations with the world?
Thank you, Ghassan. In fact, one of the key tasks of the Iraqi Foreign Ministry is to reintegrate Iraq into the international community and make Iraq a responsible member of the international community. After decades of being seen and viewed as an outlaw state, as a rogue state, as one of the main violators of human rights, of international law, and there is a great deal of work awaiting for us, in fact, to change that image, that perception. Now, one of the tasks, actually, one of the functions that we have committed ourselves to is to rehabilitate this ministry as an important institution in the political and economic reconstruction of our country. And Iraqi new foreign policy should be based on a new set of principles that renounce violence, aggression, threats against its neighbors, and to be a law-abiding nation. This is actually the vision, the view that we have for our new country. Now, as you said, in fact, we have been able to represent Iraq in many of the international organizations and forums, and that has given us more self-confidence, and also to the people of Iraq, that this new order is going to stay. The old order has gone. As far as our relations with our neighbor, there are fears, there are concerns. Many of them, in my view, are misplaced and are untrue. There is a great deal of concerns about Iraq's unity or territorial integrity, that Iraq is going to be partitioned, that is going to be divided along ethnic, sectarian lines. There would be civil war. And the problems of Iraq will spill over to neighboring countries. We have proven, since 9th of April up to now, that these expectations are not true. And the political maturity of Iraqi people have failed many of our critics and skeptics about the Iraqi people's commitment to live together in one nation. There are also concerns about Iraq being disconnected with its Arab and Islamic environment. Again, really, there are no such plans, neither by the Governing Council or by the Coalition Provisional Authorities or our allies at all to disconnect Iraq from its Arab or Islamic environment. Now, we have been visiting many of our neighbors, in fact, to reassure them that Iraq will stay as one country. There are no plans whatsoever to divide Iraq. Secondly, that your concerns about your national security, about your well-being, that about non-interventions from the future Iraq in your internal affairs are legitimate concerns, and we will address them, or the new Iraqi government will address them. But at the same time, we will not accept you dictating on the people of Iraq to decide their political future, or what political option they will choose, whether they will choose a monarchy or a president, whether they will have a centralized state or a federal state, whether they will have a secular state or a religious state, just for the sake of the argument. I mean, this is entirely up to the people of Iraq to determine and decide their future. As for our approach and outlook, in fact, to the international community, we support very strongly an active and important and expanded role for the United Nations. This will give the political process, which Dr. Pachachi said, and many other aspects of the reconstruction more credibility and more legitimacy in the eyes of the people of Iraq and in the eyes of the Arab people in the Islamic world. So we have discussed all these issues with the Secretary General, and we hope that the UN will come back, the UN will have a presence there. Secretary General will send a team to see the feasibility of holding election, that the UN will name a special representative as soon as possible. Yes, there are risks for all of us, but really the UN has worked under similar condition and situation since its creation, in war situation, in crisis situation, humanitarian issues, and so on. On the neighboring issue, on the 16th and the 17th, there will be a regional conference hosted by Kuwait, and Iraq has been invited, and it will participate in this forthcoming meeting to be part of any regional arrangement and understanding. So we are really for regional stability, we are for peace and security in the Middle East, and this old sloganeering policy, this fiery diplomatic outburst is gone from the Iraqi foreign policy. I mean, Iraq will act and behave as a responsible regional country and a member of the international community. Thank you.
Thank you, Hoshyar. You know that one of the sort of worries of the Secretary General is, of course, the question of security. And we will deal with the economy and with human rights, and the question of security will come back. And I am sure that in the audience, a lot of people would like to have a fresh assessment of how the security is in Iraq. So before giving the floor to Mr. Foley, I would like you, Dr. Adnan, to tell us what is your assessment of the security today in Iraq?
Let me put it this way. There are now about 200,000 Iraqi policemen on duty. We have several battalions of civil defense units. The Iraqi police and civil defense units are engaged far more than the coalition troops in the maintenance of security. So this is something which is a very welcome development. In other words, while the maintenance of security and law and order at the beginning was left to the coalition forces, now most of it is being handled by Iraqis. Of course, the police will have to increase the numbers, but more important, we have to really train them properly, equip them with whatever is needed to do their work, and also to pay them decent salaries. One of the things that we inherited from the previous regime was a very corrupt police force because of they were paid very poorly, and we want to see to it that the police will not be tempted to be corrupt. Also, the Iraqi army is being reorganized, but it will not be dealing with internal security. Its main function will be to help in protecting Iraq from any external threats. Of course, we can't deny that there are problems of security. But let me say first that the ordinary crimes have gone down quite a bit. I think the improvement, the steady improvement of the economic situation has helped in this respect. I'll give you an example. For example, you know, the unemployment went down from 60% to 30%, which had, of course, its beneficial effect on the law and order and the petty crimes. But of course, there are acts of violence perpetrated by a combination of the remnants of the supporters of the previous regime and outside infiltrators who feel that they are in a state of permanent war against the United States. And therefore, Iraq, they found Iraq to be a convenient and suitable battlefield because of the presence of a large American army. But I think now I think they're failing, and maybe an indication of their failure is that now they are now targeting Iraqis far more than they are attacking American or coalition troops. And we have seen in recent days and weeks, most of the casualties have been Iraqi civilians, innocent Iraqi civilians. I think this is an indication of kind of desperation on their part, that they are lashing out at these easy targets as far as they are concerned, because they are unable to do anything else. And I think with the improvement in the economic situation, this particular threat will subside.
There is indeed, thank you, Dr. Adnan, there is indeed a direct relationship between security and economy. Economy cannot thrive in a state of insecurity or full insecurity, and insecurity will grow if people have no jobs. What is your assessment, Mr. Foley, of the present situation, present state of the Iraqi economy, and how is it going to evolve in the year 2004? You have been following in particular the private sector business, but you certainly have a macroeconomic idea.
Thank you. I'm quite confident, and I think there's a lot of concentration right now on governance issues and political issues, but I actually feel that the economy, long-term, is the key to success in Iraq. There are a number of short-term problems associated with security and stability that are obvious and are being very vigorously addressed, and they include, as have been mentioned before, hiring more police, a new Iraqi army, creating more jobs, finding and arresting former followers of Saddam who foment instability as a strategy. This has declined substantially since he was arrested. And finding solutions to the political uncertainties about Iraq's future government. These problems are well known and being addressed, and I believe will be satisfactorily solved. For example, with respect to jobs, a very important issue with stability, the economy in Iraq right now is doing quite well, particularly considering it's been less than 12 months since the hostilities ended. Recent surveys, as Mr. Pachachi said, have unemployment down in the most recent ones are in the mid-20s, which is significantly below what it was after the war. And it's still too high, and certainly high enough to create instability, but it's far lower than it was, and it's decreasing. And so these are all things that are heading in the right direction. Near-term prospects for the economy and jobs appear quite good when the supplemental funds and donor funds start being spent and domestic and foreign capital begin flowing into the country, into new investments. The economy, I believe, will quickly move from recovery to boom. And I believe this transformation will happen in the next 12 to 18 months, and there'll be a whole different set of problems that Iraq will be dealing with in its economy. The part of the supplemental funds that will actually be spent locally in Iraq represents roughly a doubling of the non-oil GDP of Iraq, which is a huge number. And that should create at least 1 million additional jobs in a 7.5 million person labor force. These are typical of the short-term challenges which I am very confident will be met. What is less obvious and less certain, but no less critical in my mind, are the issues relating to the longer-term prospects of the Iraqi economy. I believe the long-term economy may in fact be the most critical factor in Iraq's success, and I believe this because democratic institutions and stability do not cause, but rather result from certain economic factors being present in a nation. The two critical economic factors are per capita income, being over a certain threshold level, and a broad enough diversification of the wealth. It's been shown that nations with annual per capita incomes under $5,000 or with highly concentrated control of the national wealth rarely support stable democratic institutions. Nations with high per capita incomes and broadly distributed wealth rarely do not have stable democratic institutions. Iraq must and can, in my opinion, obtain both of these, but not before the following things happen. With respect to incomes, annual incomes in Iraq right now are estimated about $1,500 to $2,000 per capita, and that depends on one's estimate of the size of the informal economy. Annual per capita income has been over $5,000 a year in Iraq when oil prices were higher and the economy was stronger, but not since the 1970s. To get back above $5,000 annually, Iraq must at least do the following things, in my opinion. Iraq needs to shrink the size of the public sector. The public sector is very large and adds very little value in the Iraq economy. The public sector has a hand in nearly everything in Iraq and acts more as an interrupter and suppressor of economic activity than as a facilitator. Iraq needs to open up its economy and facilitate and encourage foreign participation. Only with open markets and foreign participation will Iraq achieve the growth rate in the economy needed to get incomes over $5,000 annually soon enough to provide the stability we're looking for. And number three, Iraq needs to adopt a set of modern commercial laws, laws protecting private property, and an effective enforcement mechanism for those laws. Iraq's company laws, commercial laws, and private property laws do not currently provide sufficient assurance of ownership of property, enforcement of commercial contracts, or punishment for bad actors. The second critical challenge in the economy after improving per capita income is to ensure that the wealth of Iraq is sufficiently diversified, that no individual or small group or the government itself can reconcentrate that wealth and eliminate the need for power sharing that keeps democratic institutions healthy and stable. To do this, I believe the Iraqis should do the following. The first is to take the mineral wealth of Iraq, which is mostly oil, out from under the control of the government and put it directly into the hands of the people. This could be done through an oil trust or some similar mechanism that is irrevocable and should be independent from the government. The second is to shrink the public sector, as I said before, but also to ensure, while doing so, that no formal or informal monopolies are granted to anyone, including the government, as Iraq's economy is liberalized. If Iraq's future leadership, with the assistance of the global economy, the global community, can achieve these institutional changes and thereby enable the economy to expand and provide higher incomes and a broader distribution of wealth, I'm quite confident the outcome in Iraq, despite all the instability and uncertainties we see today and are discussing, will be a stable, peaceful, and democratic Iraq that can serve as a model for others in the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Foley. Though you want a shrinking public sector, the privatization drive is sort of frozen at the moment. How do you explain that?
Well, privatization in any case, as shown in the Eastern Bloc, takes years. It would have, in the best case in Iraq, my estimate would be that it's a 3 to 5, possibly as long as a 7-year process. The CPA has worked with the ministries and the governing council to consider how that might be done. But that's going to be a long process, and now that the transition to a sovereign government has been accelerated, it provides the opportunity for the sovereign government succeeding CPA to make those initial decisions.
Thank you, Mr. Foley. Last but not least, the questions of rights, human rights, how to maintain human rights, how to promote human rights in a situation of insecurity, of economic uncertainty, of threats against rights already gained by women movement. How could you do that in a situation like Iraq, Mr. Roth?
Thank you for the easy question. As the one unofficial member of this delegation, the one non-governmental member, I guess it's my duty to provide some of the bad news in what otherwise seemed like a cheery situation. I'd like to highlight, if I could, 4 challenges that I see facing Iraq in the rights area. The first is a different dimension of the security problem that we've been talking about. And the security problem, we must realize, remains severe with daily multiple attacks by insurgents against both coalition forces and ordinary civilians, as was mentioned. There is an understandable temptation, but a temptation that must be resisted in these circumstances, for the coalition forces to move beyond appropriate lawful responses. And so the first area of challenge is really to make sure that coalition forces behave with scrupulous regard for international humanitarian law and human rights standards. When my organization, Human Rights Watch, did a study recently of suspicious killings by coalition forces in Baghdad, we found that there was a tremendous lack of oversight. Very, very few investigations into situations of the potentially excessive use of lethal force, including, for example, a case where coalition soldiers shot at an Iraqi civilian who had his hands up, a police officer, actually. So methods like demolishing homes because a family member was seen as an insurgent, or arresting the family members of wanted insurgents, these are practices that have been used by the coalition forces and need to be resisted. They also need to resist what you might call the Afghanistan temptation, which is that in the absence of an Iraqi national army, which of course the coalition disbanded, there is a temptation not to build national institutions, but rather to resort to different militia. Now, some of those, such as the Kurdish armies, are at this point well established and disciplined, but looking to the PUK or the KDP armies is going to encourage the Shia militia to come forward. It's going to encourage tribal militia to come forward, and one has the risk of emergent warlordism, which we all have seen in Afghanistan is a recipe not only for localized repression, but also for much greater difficulty for civil society to have itself heard when it has to face local people who have their own interests at heart and the military means or the weapons to defend those interests. So this is, I think, an early stage problem. It isn't in place anywhere near the way it is in Afghanistan, but it's a point of concern as one sees the beginnings of an evolution of these militia. The second point I want to highlight is the problem of the rights of women. If you look at the governing council today, 3 of its 25 members are women. If you look at the ministers, 1 of the 25 Iraqi ministers are women. By comparison, this panel looks like it's gender balanced. So we have to be careful here. The Iraqi governing council just recently made a decision that it would take the rights of women in personal matters, which had been quite advanced under Saddam. This is one of the few good things you can say about Saddam. But women did enjoy widespread rights, at least at the same level as men in many, many areas. The Iraqi governing council has decided that it would transfer much of personal law having to do with inheritance, child custody, property rights, things of that sort, to local Sharia courts. This, if it were to be carried out, would be a disaster for women. Now, there is already some hedging by the governing council, I'm happy to say. Some members are saying, oh, we didn't know what we were doing. And so perhaps they will revoke that decision. In any event, it doesn't become law until Bremer signs it, which I presume he won't do. But it is a danger signal looking forward, because this is completely the wrong direction to be going for the women of Iraq. Third issue is the problem of the displaced. Under Saddam, he pursued the so-called Arabization policy, particularly in the area around Kirkuk, the oil-rich area in the north, which had a much more balanced population. The precise composition is a matter of dispute. But shall we say that there were many more Kurds originally than by the end of the Arabization process. Quite naturally now, many of these displaced Kurds would like to return home, but there are Arabs living in their homes. This is a problem that is probably going to become most acute this coming spring, when it seems as if there's going to be the greatest movement of displaced people home. The Governing Council recently, just in the last couple of weeks, set up a commission that is trying to resolve these kind of disputed property rights, and that's very much the right direction to go. But this is still a rudimentary institution which is going to be facing highly charged property disputes. We need to be careful that that doesn't turn into violence and that people's appropriate rights are respected, both of displaced people to return home, but also of people who may have been in their homes to, in an orderly way, be found new residences. Final point has to do with the issue of justice for the crimes of Saddam and his henchmen. And this is an issue of enormous importance because the way in which Saddam is tried in particular, or his senior lieutenants, is going to set the tone for the rule of law in Iraq in the future. So it has to be done right. And the initial steps taken are a bit troublesome. The Iraqi Governing Council has adopted a decree establishing a special tribunal, which, according to the decree so far, would preclude any foreigner from serving as a prosecutor or an investigator. It would allow foreign advisors, but no foreigner could serve as a prosecutor or an investigator. A foreigner could serve as a judge if he or she were invited. But it's clear that this is going to be very much an Iraqi-led and Iraqi-dominated, perhaps, process. Now, in principle, that's great. I mean, in principle, Iraqis should be in charge of prosecuting their former persecutors. The problem comes when you get down to the reality of whether Iraqi jurists have the experience to put together and try fairly these enormously complex trials that will be taking place for genocide or crimes against humanity. We have talked to many, many lawyers in Baghdad and elsewhere, and frankly, we couldn't find anyone who remembered a trial that had lasted more than a day and a half. In fact, your typical Iraqi judge, even this past October, was averaging 20 minutes a trial. So there is a huge problem of expertise here. Now, they are receiving training, but I can say as a former prosecutor myself that, a few months training is not going to be enough to figure out how to try to manage a prosecution of this complexity. This calls out for the involvement of international jurists who, frankly, have developed some considerable expertise through the Rwanda, the Yugoslav, the Sierra Leone, etc. prosecutions. Now, I'm not advocating a full-fledged international tribunal a la Yugoslavia or Rwanda, which have been expensive propositions, very distant from the places of the crime, and thus less meaningful for the local population. But I think a very useful model to look at would be the special court set up for Sierra Leone, in which there is very significant involvement by Sierra Leonean jurists. The court is located in Sierra Leone, but it draws extensively on international expertise. That is the best way to ensure that the trial of Saddam and his henchmen serves as a precedent for the rule of law rather than yet another example of arbitrary rule. Unfortunately, there is considerable resistance to this idea of a mixed tribunal. The Iraqis, understandably, as a matter of national pride, want to run it themselves. They also understandably are suspicious of the international community since so many countries were complicit in Saddam's crimes, including the United States. The U.S. government also is opposed to a mixed tribunal, in part because it wants the death penalty, even though, frankly, breaking Saddam's culture of death would be a very important part of moving forward. It is afraid that an unfettered trial would bring up past U.S. complicity. And of course, the Bush administration detests the entire system of international justice and doesn't want to further it at all for fear that this might advance in an indirect way the International Criminal Court. Needless to say, none of those reasons have to do with the best interests of the Iraqi people. It is important to do this trial right if we are going to set a positive precedent, and it is absolutely essential for the rule of law that occur. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Ken, for this very important addition to our panel. I think we can take one or two very quick questions, if there are. One. We started late, I'm sorry for that.
Hi, my name is Peter Mackler. I'm with AFP News Agency. I have a question for Mr. Pachachi and Mr. Zebari. As we stand now, we're going to have a transfer of sovereignty to the Iraqis on July 1st. We're still going to have about 100,000 U.S. troops there. during the occupation, there's been a whole range of issues that have been contentious and that the U.S. will obviously still be heavily invested in. I'm talking about things like the awarding of foreign contracts, foreign investment, even the issue of Saddam's trial, rules of engagement for U.S. troops, a whole range of issues that they're going to be very, very heavily invested. My question to you, sir, is that are you absolutely sure that you're going to have full authority in all these areas, and what are you going to do if you don't get it?
Well, we hope to conclude a status of forces agreement with the coalition by the end of March of this year. And of course, it's wrong for me to anticipate the issues that will be dealt with in this agreement. But I take your point. There are many matters that have to be resolved, and resolved in a manner that will make it quite clear to the Iraqi people that their sovereignty is complete and unfettered. Naturally, but we prefer this to the occupation. We prefer an agreement between two sovereign nations, or between several sovereign nations and a sovereign Iraqi government. There are many examples, actually, of status of forces agreements between the United States and other countries. And we'll see whatever is suitable for Iraq. Let us not forget that until our army is has the sufficient numbers and equipment and ability to protect Iraq against external threat, we will be in need of either coalition forces or multinational forces under some kind of United Nations umbrella. But all these things have to be worked out in this agreement. Regarding the financial aspects, this will not be part of the agreement at all. These things, of course, will be a matter for the sovereign Iraqi government to deal with the American government. After all, they are giving more than $18 billion, and we have already set up a machinery in Iraq for the coordination of this assistance coming from the United States and also from other countries.
Hoshyar?
Yeah, I would like to add one more thing. In fact, we as Iraqi feel that there would be a need for the presence of the coalition forces, United States and other coalition forces, until we build our military security capacity to a level we will be able to control the country. Now, as Dr. Pachachi said, and it is embedded, in fact, in the political agreement, there would be discussions with the coalition about their future status in the country by the end of March. And then any final agreement needs to be ratified by the Iraqi Interim Assembly that would be elected and selected at the same time. But our view that really these forces are needed for some times to come. First, to protect Iraq's exterior borders from any interventions from neighboring countries. Secondly, their presence would be a deterrence for internal peace, to maintain the internal peace until we build the right institution and we will be able to have a representative democratic government. So in this, really, we have been very honest with everybody, saying that we need these forces until we are ready to take responsibilities. Now, as Dr. Pachachi said, we are building actually the military, the police force, but still it will take time. I may disagree with Ken on one point about militias and warlords, and the culture of warlordism. In fact, the idea, I think, was misrepresented from the beginning. We believe now, for maintaining security or enforcing security, you need some political forces committed to the new order. We have many police people recruited, we have many armies, but they are not fully really committed to protect the new freedoms, the new order. That is where we might discuss this.
You will have to, Hoshyar, because this session is now off. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.